This video is brought to you by Factor. Go to factormeals.com/Murrell50off and use code Murrell50off for a special offer, and stay tuned after the video for more info. Hello everybody, I'm Dan Murrell, here to look at something that has been dominating headlines here in the US and around the world for the last couple of weeks. Now, as you know, we don't usually do politics or geopolitics here on the channel, but this is something that directly affects the movie industry, and so I wanted to break down the numbers and try to bring what insight I could to the situation. Last week, rumors were flying that in response to the escalating trade war between the US and China, that the Chinese government may reduce importing Hollywood films or ban them altogether. That was partially confirmed late last week when an official from China's National Film Administration told a reporter, quote, "We will follow market rules, respect the audience's choice, and moderately reduce the number of American films imported." So with a reduction in imported Hollywood films now confirmed, and I would argue in a worst case scenario, a ban potentially still on the table, what does this mean for the film industry here in the United States? Well, if you look at the numbers for the past decade or so, it's clear that the relationship between Hollywood and China has been evolving long before the current situation. Let's go back 10 years to 2015. The MCU was in full swing, Jurassic World and Star Wars relaunched their franchises, and China fully embraced films from Hollywood as they continue to develop and upgrade their own domestic film industry. For a few months, Furious 7 became the highest grossing film in Chinese history, taking the record from Avatar. Of the 25 highest grossing films worldwide in 2015, 24 of them were from Hollywood. The only one that wasn't was China's Monster Hunt at number 21 worldwide, which actually replaced Furious 7 as China's highest ever grossing film domestically just a few months after it grabbed the record, a record that's only been held by Chinese films since. The legitimacy of Monster Hunt's box office achievement in China was later called into question, leading to steps being taken to avoid similar situations in the future. Now, it's important to note that China determines whether or not a Hollywood film is going to get a theatrical release in the country. But even given that, in 2015, of the 24 highest grossing films worldwide that were from Hollywood, 21 of them got a Chinese release. And of the $16.2 billion that those 21 films made worldwide, $2 billion of that came from China, about 12.6% of the total worldwide revenue for those movies. That's the baseline that we're going to start from. In 2016, 14.1% of the global revenue for the top Hollywood films globally that were released in China came from the Chinese market. In 2017, that number rose to 15.7%, then 16.4% in 2018, before falling to 12.9% in 2019, mostly due to several major Disney releases that performed exceptionally well outside of China. Then COVID hit, and 2020 was pretty much a lost year for box office in the United States because theaters were closed for most of the year. China actually became the world's #1 film market in 2020 because they reopened their theaters sooner, and 4 of the top 10 highest grossing films worldwide were Chinese releases. The highest grossing film worldwide in 2020 was from Japan, Demon Slayer the movie, Mugen Train. In 2021, China was once again the world's biggest film market, with 8 of the top 25 highest grossing films being from China and 3 of the top 10 being Chinese releases. And of the 17 other films in the worldwide top 25 for 2021, all of which were from Hollywood, 8 of them did not get released in China at all, including Spider-Man No Way Home and every other MCU film that year. But of the 9 remaining Hollywood movies in the global top 25 that did get a release in China, 18.5% of their worldwide revenue came from the Chinese market. So why did the number of Hollywood films released in China drop so drastically in 2021? Well, part of it is that China was celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, and their goal with the film industry that year was to focus on domestic releases and to really boost the Chinese film industry. But the bigger trend seemed to be China sending a message that Hollywood was no longer required for them to generate the majority of their box office revenues. And when it comes to worldwide gross, the biggest Chinese share for a Hollywood film that year was for Godzilla vs. Kong at 40.1%, which was co-owned and produced by Legendary, which was at that time a Chinese company. The movie was released day and date on streaming in the US. In 2022, 19 of the 25 highest grossing global films came from Hollywood, but 10 of them were never released in China, including Top Gun Maverick and 2 more films from the MCU. Of the 9 Hollywood films that were in the global top 25 and received a Chinese release, just 7.8% of their worldwide gross was generated by the Chinese market, amid an overall decline in attendance that year in China. In 2023, more Hollywood films were allowed into the Chinese market. 16 out of 19 Hollywood movies in the worldwide top 25 were released in China, but just 7.3% of the worldwide revenue from those films came from the Chinese market. Even though Hollywood films were flowing back into China, Chinese filmgoers were attending in smaller numbers, despite the fact that in 2023, movie attendance in China hit a 4-year peak. That trend carried over into last year's box office. 19 of the 20 Hollywood films in the global top 25 were given a Chinese release, but just 5.1% of the global box office revenue of those films came from the Chinese market. Now, the drop in revenue for Hollywood films released in China has gone hand in hand with the emergence of China as being more of a force when it comes to the overall worldwide box office, mainly driven by increased domestic revenues. In 2015, only one Chinese movie was in the global top 25, Monster Hunt, which we mentioned before. China placed one film in the global top 25 in 2016 and one in the top 25 in 2017, though that film was Wolf Warrior 2, which set new Chinese records and ranked 7th in the world overall. In 2018, China had 3 movies in the top 25, Operation Red Sea, Detective Chinatown 2, and Dying to Survive. In 2019, that number went up to 4. China placed 13 movies in the top 25 in 2020, while the US market was largely shut down. In 2021, with the US market opening back up, that number was at 8, with 3 of the top 10 being Chinese releases. The Battle at Lake Changjin was 2nd overall worldwide in 2021, bringing in over $900 million and becoming the new highest grossing film in Chinese history. Of the top 25 worldwide releases in 2022, 4 were from China. In 2023, that number rose to 6, and last year in 2024, 5 of the global top 25s came from the Chinese market. Overall, Chinese films have gone from being a rare occurrence in the worldwide top 25 to being a constant presence, accompanied by a downturn in Chinese grosses for Hollywood films. So we've already been dealing with an increase in film production in China and a decrease in attendance for Hollywood movies, and yet many are arguing that a reduced number of Hollywood imports or a ban altogether would be ruinous to the Hollywood film industry. I would argue that this is just an extension of something that's already been happening for several years, and studios have been adjusting or should have been adjusting to this reality already. However, looking at the trends over the past 10 years, I think that there are some genres and franchises that are particularly susceptible to a reduced number of Hollywood films in China, or in the worst case, an outright ban altogether. Now, there are some stars like Dwayne Johnson and Tom Cruise, and some franchises like the MCU that have already seen their grosses lowered in China. And there are some franchises like Avatar that are still popular in China, but also popular enough in other parts of the world that I think a ban or a decision not to release that film in China wouldn't necessarily affect their overall well-being, at least not in a drastic way. But these franchises and genres, I think, could see some real trouble if they are not able to secure Chinese releases. The first one is the Fast and Furious franchise. The Fast and Furious films are still very popular in China. Chinese box office made up 20% of Furious 7's overall global gross, 31.8% of The Fate of the Furiouses, 26.4% of Hobbs and Shaw's, 29.9% of F9's, and 19.8% of Fast X's, in a year that saw a big decline in Chinese attendance for other Hollywood films overall. With the franchise declining in other parts of the world, most notably domestically, should Fast and Furious have its Chinese release in question, that could affect the budget, that could affect the production of the sequel to Fast X, which is currently on the schedule for 2026, but hasn't officially entered production yet. The Transformers live action films, I think, would also be at risk. 3 live action Transformers films have been released in the last 10 years, and they all benefited from the Chinese box office disproportionately. 37.8% of the last night's gross was from China, 36.5% of Bumblebee's gross was Chinese, and 20.7% of Rise of the Beasts' global gross was also from China. And while the animated film Transformers 1 wasn't really a big hit anywhere in the world, over 16% of its gross came from China. Much like the Fast franchise, the Transformers live action films and the franchise overall have really faded, especially if we're talking domestically, and a lack of Chinese release or even question about it could affect a future film getting the green light. The MonsterVerse is in a very interesting situation. The new Godzilla Kong films are produced by Legendary, which from 2016 until late last year was controlled by Wanda, a Chinese conglomerate. Because of Wanda's partial ownership of the franchise, the films were given a big boost in China. Chinese grosses made up 29.6% of Kong Skull Island's global box office. That went up to 35% for Godzilla King of the Monsters and 40.1% for Godzilla vs. Kong, before falling to 23.1% for Godzilla Kong: The New Empire. There is a new Godzilla Kong film that is in production. It's on the release calendar for 2027, but Wanda sold their stake in Legendary late last year. So it's no longer a Chinese-controlled company, and you have to wonder, even with the success of the previous films in the Chinese market, whether a new MonsterVerse film would be one of the ones that was guaranteed to get a release in China, and even if it did, would it get the same promotion as the previous films? The Jurassic World franchise has never been as reliant on Chinese grosses as other franchises have been. 13.7% of Jurassic World's gross was from China, rising to 20% for Fallen Kingdom, and then dropping to 15.7% for Jurassic World Dominion. But there have been some signs that the franchise may be fading a bit domestically, and if Jurassic World Rebirth, which is being released this summer, continues that trend and the future of Chinese releases is in question, then I think that we could see some second guessing from studios as far as the future of that franchise. Again, if the box office performance overall is less than expected. The Meg is another franchise that I think could really be in question here. Jason Statham's 2 Meg movies were actually produced in conjunction with Chinese companies, and the Chinese market was key to the success of both films, making up about 29% of the overall global gross for both movies. A third film was already questionable after the drop-off in gross for Meg 2: The Trench, but if the franchise has trouble maintaining their Chinese ties, then that could be the final decision maker on whether a third Meg movie will ever get made. Movies either based on video games or around video games have often done very well in the Chinese market too. Ready Player One got 37.4% of its global gross from China. Detective Pikachu brought in 21.6%, and Free Guy had a 28.6% share from China. 2016's Warcraft actually did most of its business in China, 51.4% of its global gross. It was helped, of course, by being a production of Legendary, and a Minecraft movie opened at #1 in China just last weekend, though the numbers were considerably smaller than we may have seen from other American films in the past, about 10% of its overall opening weekend. If Chinese releases became harder to come by, then greenlighting a video game film, which can sometimes be a bit of a dicey proposition as far as whether it's going to do well or not, could get even harder. And finally, we have big budget sci-fi. China has turned things around, or at least mitigated the damage, for several big sci-fi films in the last decade. Terminator Genesis turned to China after a disappointing domestic performance in 2015 and generated 25.7% of its total gross from the market. Alita Battle Angel pulled in 32.9% of its worldwide gross from China, which was enough to at least keep talk of a sequel alive. And last summer, Alien Romulus brought in nearly a third of its global gross from China, which combined with smart budgeting helped to make that film a moderate success. With no guarantee or likelihood of a Chinese release, then it could become more likely that studios wouldn't greenlight a big budget sci-fi film, and these are movies that are often hard to get made in the first place. Overall, there's no denying that a reduction on the import of American films or a ban of them altogether would certainly be detrimental to the American film industry, but it wouldn't be ruinous, and it certainly wouldn't hurt as much as if it had happened 10 years ago or even pre-COVID. Even companies that do business in China like IMAX, who owns several theaters in that country, could shift their strategy to showing more Chinese films instead of Hollywood films if there's a hole in the release schedule, because films made in China are already doing more business in the country than Hollywood films are. Chinese box office revenue, of course, would take a bit of a hit by showing fewer American films, largely because China keeps a much bigger portion of the box office than many other countries. Reportedly, only 20 to 25% of the Chinese gross goes back to the Hollywood studios anyway, but those numbers have already been going down before any of this even started. And the Chinese market has already generated a $2.1 billion grossing movie this year with Ne Zha 2, the highest grossing movie of the year so far worldwide, with almost all of that money flowing into the Chinese domestic box office market. So their losses wouldn't be altogether drastic either. I honestly think that in many ways, Hollywood needs the Chinese grosses more than China needs Hollywood films. In the short term, I think we're just going to see an extension of what we've already been seeing the last few years. I think that China is going to strategically decide which American films will benefit their box office, because a movie like Avatar, Fire and Ash, or the latest Jurassic World film, I think is going to do them more good by allowing it to be imported than it would if they decided not to allow that import. But overall, it's the movies like Alien Romulus that I think could be hurt. That's the type of movie I could see China deciding not to import, whereas they have been importing films like that in the recent past. But if things continue to escalate on the global trade front, I don't think that an eventual outright ban on all American films is out of the question. And what would that lead to? Well, I think that it would lead to studios giving smaller budgets to their blockbuster films. I think it might lead to more investment in movies that have more appeal domestically and that might be catering a little less to a worldwide market. And I'm actually not necessarily saying that those are bad things. But the overall takeaway for me is that this is just another injection of chaos into an American film industry that's already had about 5 years of chaos. They've had to roll with the punches for quite a while now, and this is yet another one that they're just going to have to deal with. So those are my thoughts on the current situation between the US and China. What do you think? What do you think the effects on the global market are going to be? Let me know down in the comments below. And before we go, I want to thank the sponsor for this video, Factor. It's officially springtime, which means that you want to spend your time enjoying the warm temperatures, making your yard look great, and maybe doing your best to assistant coach your nephew's soccer team despite not knowing much about soccer. Okay, maybe that last one's just me, but the point is you don't want to spend your time indoors cooking, and that's where Factor comes in. Factor sends meals straight to you that are ready to heat and eat in just 2 minutes. No prep, no cooking, just eating, with over 45 choices every week to fit your goals, including having the time to do what you want. You can try Calorie Smart if you're trying to trim weight, Protein Plus if you're looking to add bulk, or even Factor's keto meals. And Factor can power your entire day with add-ons including delicious breakfasts, lunches on the go, and guilt-free snacks and desserts. It's all of the flavor with none of the fuss. This week, Factor's offering options like roasted garlic, butter salmon, and chicken Florentine that look great. And you can add on breakfast for the whole week, which includes pancakes and eggs, a breakfast skillet, a frittata, and more. Get started right now at factormeals.com/Murrell50off and use code Murrell50off to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. That's code Murrell50off at factormeals.com/Murrell50off for 50% off plus free shipping. Thanks to Factor for sponsoring this video, and thank you for watching. Be sure to stay tuned right here for more movie news, reviews, box office, and more. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.